The Duke married the wrong twin. He realized it on their wedding night when she cried out. The Church of St. George's, Hanover Square, had never been so quiet on a Wednesday. That was Rosalind Fairfax's first thought as she stood in the vestry, her sister's wedding gown pulled tight across shoulders that were half an inch narrower than Cecilia's. The second thought, the one she could not silence, was that she was going to be sick. "Stop fidgeting." Her father's voice came from behind her, low and without warmth. Sir Aldous Fairfax was a man who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of appearing composed whilst the walls fell around him, and today was no different. He adjusted the veil over Rosalind's face with the clinical precision of a man settling a bill. "The ribbons are straight. Stand still. Father." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I beg you to reconsider." "There is nothing to reconsider." He stepped back to inspect her. Outside, the organ had begun, some ponderous, inevitable thing in D major. "Cecilia made her choice at 10:30 this morning. You are making yours now." Rosalind looked at her own hands. She had put on Cecilia's gloves, white kid leather that fit precisely, and it occurred to her that even her hands had been replaced. Somewhere in Yorkshire, or perhaps already aboard a packet boat to the continent, her sister was laughing. Cecilia had always known how to leave a room. "He will notice," Rosalind said. "He must notice. He has met Cecilia precisely 4 times, all in public, all chaperoned." Sir Aldous opened the vestry door a fraction. The organ swelled. "He is marrying a name, not a face. Now walk." She walked. The nave of St. George's was full. She was aware of that in the way one is aware of a great height, not clearly, but as a pressure, a collective held breath. Faces turned. She kept her eyes on the aisle ahead, on the gray stone floor worn smooth by 2 centuries of brides who had not been substituted at the last moment. The veil was heavy. The light through the high windows fell in pale oblongs across the pews, and the smell of candle wax and old wood and someone's too ambitious perfume made the whole scene feel faintly unreal. She passed the Trelawney family in the 3rd pew on the left. She recognized the matriarch's hat, a construction of ostrich feathers that she had once overheard Cecilia describe accurately as a bird that had lost a disagreement with a milliner. Behind them, the Grenville cousins. And behind them, a row of gentlemen she did not know. And behind them, filling the rear of the nave, the people who had come because they had been invited, and because declining an invitation from the Duke of Blackmir was not done. He was waiting at the altar. Evander Greycliffe, Duke of Blackmir, stood with his back very slightly turned, not from rudeness, she would understand later, but from a lifelong habit of never presenting himself fully to a room he had not yet assessed. He was taller than she had imagined from the twice she had seen him at a distance. Dark coat, immaculate linen, one hand resting at his side with the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself not to fidget. His hair was darker than she had expected, and his jaw had the quality of something carved rather than grown. He turned when he heard her approach. Through the veil, she could not read his expression. She stopped beside him. The vicar began. Rosalind fixed her gaze on a point somewhere between the altar cloth and eternity, and concentrated on breathing. The words were very old. She had heard them before, at the weddings of neighbors and cousins, and they had always seemed abstract, ceremonial, a pleasing arrangement of syllables that meant something to the people speaking them. Today they fell on her like stones. "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony?" There was a pause, not a long one, half a breath, but she felt the Duke turn his head toward her, and she understood suddenly that Cecilia, the real Cecilia, the one who had rehearsed this, who had been anticipating this moment for 6 weeks, would not have paused at all. "I will," she said. The ring was cold. His fingers were warm, and that was the detail she had not prepared for. The warmth of his hand around hers as he placed the ring on her finger, careful and entirely impersonal, as a man might handle a document of importance. She kept very still. The ceremony continued. Afterwards there was rice and people pressing forward, and a woman in a yellow turban who embraced her and said something about radiant, and Rosalind smiled and nodded and let herself be moved through it all like furniture being rearranged. She answered questions. She received congratulations. She said thank you and you are most kind the requisite number of times, and all the while some cold, separate part of her observed herself performing it and noted that she was not doing badly. All things considered. In the carriage to Blackmir House, the Duke sat across from her. The distance between the two seats was approximately 3 feet. He did not speak for some time. The horse's hooves on Grosvenor Square's cobblestones made a sound like slow, regular breathing. The carriage smelled of leather and the faint, dry scent of the pressed flower someone had tucked inside her bouquet. She could hear the crowd outside thinning as they turned off the main square, and then the relative quiet of the side streets, and then nothing but the horses. "You are cold," he said at last. Rosalind looked down. Her hands, still gloved, were pressed together in her lap. "A little," she said. He reached across and adjusted the carriage rug across her knees, a gesture that was entirely impersonal, efficient, the way a man might close a window. Then he sat back and looked at her for a moment, a brief, assessing glance, and then looked out the window. He looked out the window for the rest of the journey. The reception at Blackmir House lasted 4 hours. The rooms on the ground floor smelled of hothouse flowers and beeswax candles, and underneath that the particular cold that clung to large Berkeley Square houses in March, regardless of how many fires were laid. Rosalind drank 2 glasses of champagne and ate nothing, and spoke to everyone who addressed her, and she never once answered to her own name, because no one used it. They called her Your Grace and the new Duchess, and both felt like garments belonging to someone else. She was introduced to the Duke's solicitor, a narrow man called Whitmore, who shook her hand without warmth and said he looked forward to calling at her convenience. She was presented to the Dowager Countess of something or other, whose name she did not retain, and to 3 viscounts and their wives, and to a retired admiral who was quite deaf and thought she had said something she had not said, and laughed heartily for an uncomfortably long time. She bore it all. She had learned to bear things. She excused herself at 7:30 on the pretext of a headache, which was true, and went upstairs with the maid her father had sent. A thin girl called Agnes, who had been Cecilia's for 2 years and therefore knew everything and had, to her considerable credit, said nothing about any of it. Agnes said nothing as she undressed her, nothing as she let down Rosalind's hair, which was darker than Cecilia's by 2 shades, a fact that was not visible in candlelight, Rosalind had been told, and she had chosen to believe it because she had needed to believe something. Nothing as she withdrew, closing the door with the careful softness of someone who wished to be invisible. Rosalind sat in the chair by the fire and looked at her reflection in the glass across the room. The fire crackled. A coal shifted with a sound like a door being quietly opened. Somewhere in the house below, she could hear the last of the guests departing, the scrape of chairs, a burst of male laughter, the eventual silence of a Berkeley Square evening settling over everything. A carriage passed outside. The candle on the dressing table had burned down unevenly on one side, and a thin rivulet of wax was making its slow, deliberate way toward the candlestick's base. She waited. She looked at the ring on her hand. Gold, simply made, old, a family ring, she supposed, passed down through however many duchesses of Blackmir had come before her. She had not thought to ask about it at the ceremony, and now it occurred to her that whoever had worn it last had done so with considerably more right to it than she had. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at it for a long time, and somewhere in the looking she ceased to pay attention to anything else. Not to the hour, not to the cold creeping in at the window, not to the left glove that had ridden steadily down her wrist over the course of the evening and now sat loosely at her palm, the inside of her wrist bare to the firelight. She did not notice. She waited. He came at 11. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, deliberate, and she stood because sitting seemed wrong, and then was not sure whether standing was better. The fire had burned lower in the past hour, and the room had taken on the particular chill of a large house in which the servants had gone to bed and left the cold to manage itself. The rose water Agnes had used on her hair had dried, and the room smelled, instead of cooling wax and the faint green smell of the hothouse flowers someone had arranged on the mantelpiece, which were already beginning to close. The door opened. The Duke of Blackmir stood in the frame and looked at her. He was still in his evening clothes, coat removed now, cravat loosened at the throat. He carried a single candle. The flame moved in the draught from the door, and in that unsteady light, his face was difficult to read. All planes and shadows, the set of his jaw, the stillness that she had already learned was not coldness, but something more like control, and considerable amounts of it. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent the day doing something he considered a duty, and was now prepared to continue doing so. He came into the room. She did not plan what happened next. Later she would understand that the human body has its own intelligence, separate from intention, that it acts on information the mind has not yet processed, drawing on older, more foundational knowledge than thought can access. She had spent 7 hours telling herself that this was an arrangement, a necessity, a thing to be endured with dignity. She had rehearsed it. She had been, she believed, very composed. Then he set the candle on the bedside table and reached up, slowly, to touch her face. Not roughly, not unkindly, with the particular tentative precision of a man who was himself uncertain, and something in her, something very old and very frightened and entirely beyond her management, reacted before thought could intervene. She cried out, not loudly, not the scream of a melodrama, but clearly, unmistakably, a single involuntary sound, sharp as a struck bell, that she could not have swallowed back even if she had tried. The sound of a body that had understood something the mind was still attempting to reason away. He stopped. His hand was still in the air, an inch from her face. The room was very still. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Her heart was striking the inside of her ribs in great irregular blows, and her breath had gone shallow. And she was entirely certain he could hear it, because the silence was so complete that she could hear his, and his was steady, and hers was not. He did not move toward her again. He stood exactly where he was, and his expression, which had been carefully neutral, the expression of a man executing a task, shifted into something she could not name. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it entirely to himself. He looked at her the way a person looks at a problem they had not anticipated finding. Then, slowly, he reached out and picked up the candle again. He walked to the writing table. He lit the larger candle there, then another on the mantel, then turned the lamp up until the room was properly illuminated, fully, unambiguously lit, so that there was no dark corner, no shadow, nothing that could be mistaken. He turned to look at her. In the full candlelight, everything was visible that the ceremony and the reception and the careful performance of the day had kept hidden. The particular darkness of her hair, not golden brown as Cecilia's was golden brown, but darker, closer to chestnut. The gray of her eyes, not blue. The way she held herself, which was different from Cecilia's way of holding herself. Less performative, more contained, as if she had learned to take up a precise and minimal amount of space and had become expert at it. And the scar. The left glove had ridden down in the long hours of the evening, and she had never thought to replace it. Distracted, exhausted, lost in the ring and the cold cup and the retreating sound of guests. She had not known it was visible. The inside of her left wrist was bare in the candlelight. 2 inches of old silver scar, clean and pale, running along the vein line from a childhood fall on a fence rail at her father's estate in Wiltshire. She had been 8. The doctor had called it superficial. Cecilia had not been there. Cecilia had never seen it, because Rosalind wore long sleeves in summer and gloves in winter, and had learned, as she had learned most things, to manage the situation quietly. He looked at her wrist for a very long time. "Take off the glove," he said. His voice was entirely without inflection. She could not tell from it whether he was angry, whether he was anything. She peeled the glove off slowly, the kid leather cool and slightly resistant, and held out her hand. The scar caught the candlelight. Old, clean, unmistakably hers. Cecilia had no such scar. The Duke set the candle down. He went to the chair by the window and sat in it. He did not look at her. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and sat in complete silence for long enough that the fire behind her settled with a soft, collapsing sound, and the candle she had left burning on the mantelpiece guttered once in a draught she could not locate. He was silent for so long that she wondered if he had decided to wait until morning, as a man might set aside a letter he did not wish to open, leaving it on the desk until he had assembled sufficient composure to deal with its contents properly. Then he said, "Tell me your name." She could have lied. She considered it for precisely one breath, considered the complications of lying, the particular quality of this man's attention that suggested he would investigate whatever she told him and verify it by morning, and the cold, clarifying thought that she was already guilty of enough. "Rosalind," she said. "Rosalind Fairfax. I was Cecilia's twin." "Where is Cecilia?" "I don't know precisely. Yorkshire, perhaps, by now. With the Captain Hurst of the 14th Foot." She paused. She had rehearsed this part too, in the 3 weeks since her father had first presented her with the situation, and it came out more evenly than she expected. She was with child when she left, his child. Whether she remained so, I cannot say. We had no communication after she went. She refused to go through with the wedding. My father... She stopped, looked at her hands. "My father made certain arrangements." A pause. "And you agreed to this," he said. It was not entirely a question. She looked at the word agreed with the care it deserved. She thought about her father's voice in the vestry, and the night 3 weeks before when he had called her into the study and told her what was required of her with the tone of a man announcing a minor administrative change, and the way he had looked at her when she had begun to object, the particular dismissive look that she had been receiving from him since childhood, the one that meant "you are the wrong daughter and always have been." "I was not given very many alternatives, Your Grace," she said. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't suppose you were." He stood. He walked to the door that connected to the adjoining room, his room, and put his hand on the frame. He did not look at her. "You will sleep here," he said. "I will sleep there. In the morning we will speak again." A pause, measured, as if he were choosing each word with the same precision he brought to everything else. "You need not be afraid of me, Miss Fairfax." Another pause, shorter. "Or I suppose it is Duchess now." His voice on the word was perfectly flat, not contemptuous, not bitter, merely noting a fact. "Whatever else this is, you have my word on that much." The door closed behind him. Rosalind stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then her legs ceased to cooperate in the way legs sometimes do when the emergency has passed, and the body, having held itself together through main force for the duration, decides it has done enough. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands. She breathed carefully, in and out. The fire had settled to a steady glow. Outside, the last carriage of the evening passed along Berkeley Square, its wheels loud on the wet stones, and then it was gone, and the street was silent. She did not cry. She had learned, very young, that crying was a thing Cecilia did and she did not because she felt less, but because somewhere along the way she had understood that her feelings were not particularly of interest to anyone, and it was better to be useful than visible. Visible invited scrutiny. Useful invited continuation. She lay down on top of the coverlet, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, then 1, then 2. She did not sleep. In the morning he came at 7, before she had expected him, while her hair was still down, and she was sitting at the window with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, watching a crossing sweeper begin his methodical work at the corner of the square below. He looked at her for a moment across the room, taking in, she supposed, the undressed hair and the cold cup, and the fact that she had clearly not slept. She looked back at him and said nothing. He had slept. Or if he had not, he gave no indication of it. He was dressed, shaved, composed, the Duke of Blackmir at 7 in the morning, which was, she suspected, indistinguishable from the Duke of Blackmir at any other hour. "I have thought about it," he said. "We cannot have an annulment. The marriage was announced in the Gazette." My solicitors estimate the political damage to the ducal interests would take 3 years to repair, and I have several matters before Parliament that cannot withstand that kind of disruption. He came to stand near the fire, which he surveyed with brief displeasure and then, impatiently, without calling for the footman, rebuilt himself, adding coals from the scuttle with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to managing things that needed managing. The marriage will continue. She had known this was coming. She had known it at midnight, and at 2, and in the gray, pre-dawn hour when the square below had been entirely silent, and she had had nothing to do but think. Still, hearing it stated with such flat, administrative certainty was different from expecting it. "I understand," she said. "I want to be clear about the terms." He stood and brushed the coal dust from his hands. "You will be treated as my wife in every public context. You will have the houses, the income, the social standing that the title carries. My staff will answer to you. My accounts, insofar as they concern the household, are available to you." He looked at her steadily. "In private, you are not obligated to anything you do not choose. I will not press a claim I did not consent to. Is that plain enough?" "Perfectly plain, Your Grace." "Good." He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, a habit she would come to know. "I will require you at Blackmir Hall in Northumberland by the end of the month. I have business in London that will delay me until then. Agnes will remain with you. If you require anything in my absence, Whitmore is at your disposal." He paused again. "Do you have what you need in the meantime?" She thought about what she had. Cecilia's wardrobe. No money of her own. She had never had money of her own. No address. No name that anyone in London would recognize as hers. A ring that belonged to a family she had entered by fraud. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He left. She sat for a moment longer with the cold cup in her hands. Then she set it down, went to the dressing table, and began to pin up her own hair. She had done it herself for years when Agnes was occupied with Cecilia. She was rather good at it. She would need to learn everything. The estate, the staff, the expectations, the neighbors, the political considerations. She would need to become, convincingly and durably, a duchess. She had taught herself Latin from a grammar found in the attic. She had learned Italian from letters in an old trunk. She had managed her father's household accounts from the age of 15. She had spent 21 years living beside Cecilia, without anyone pausing to inquire whether they were, in fact, different people entirely. She could learn this. She squared her shoulders and rang for Agnes. Blackmir Hall announced itself from 2 miles distant. Rosalind saw it first through the carriage window as they crested the ridge above the valley. A great gray house rising from a landscape that was itself gray. The moors rolling away in every direction under a sky the color of old pewter. The lake to the east flat and dark as a mirror laid face down. It was the kind of house that had not been built so much as grown. Accretion by accretion over many centuries. One wing adding itself to another in the way that families accumulate obligations. There was a keep at one end that was very old, Norman, perhaps, or older, and a Georgian addition at the other end that had been designed by someone who had seen Palladian architecture once and retained approximately half of it. And between the two extremes stretched a long, irregular body of house that was neither one thing nor the other, but had achieved over the centuries a kind of sullen dignity, large, cold, entirely without charm. She felt for a moment that it suited her perfectly. The Duke had arrived 2 days before her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pleat, a stout, capable Northumbrian woman of about 50, who assessed Rosalind with the patient, comprehensive gaze of someone who had weathered 4 dukes and was entirely prepared to weather a 5th, had received instruction that the Duchess was to be given whatever she required and consulted on whatever she wished. "His Grace is particular about the estate accounts," Mrs. Pleat said, showing her through the ground floor. The stone floors were clean, the furniture good but old, the windows in the north corridor so ancient that the glass had begun to warp, distorting the view of the kitchen garden into something vaguely impressionistic. The whole house smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and underlying both, the peculiar mineral smell of the moorland that seeped in through every crack and made itself at home. He does not like surprises. Neither do I, Rosalind said. Mrs. Pleat looked at her with the faint, assessing expression of a woman revising an estimate upward. She said nothing further on the subject. Rosalind concluded correctly that she had passed some kind of preliminary examination. The Duke met her at dinner the first evening. They sat at opposite ends of a table that was, she privately estimated, long enough to accommodate a small horse, and they were served 4 courses in near-perfect silence, broken only by the click of cutlery on china, the footman's careful and inaudible movements behind them, and, at one point, the distant sound of a door somewhere in the house banging in the wind that had come up off the moors after sunset. The candles between them made it difficult to read his face. "How was the journey?" he asked, halfway through the fish course. "Tolerable. The road past Alnwick is in poor repair. I have written to the surveyor. I imagine you have." A pause. He looked at her across the candles. "You are not afraid of silence," he said. "No," she said. "Are you?" He considered this with rather more seriousness than it perhaps warranted, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. He did not dismiss questions. "I find it preferable," he said finally, "to most alternatives." She ate another bite of the fish, which was good, and thought that she agreed with him entirely. "I would like to see the estate books," she said, "if that is agreeable." "Why?" "To understand what I am part of." She set down her fork. "I am not suggesting I intend to interfere with anything. I simply prefer to understand the systems I inhabit. It helps me to be more useful." He studied her for a moment. "Very well," he said. "I will tell Hawkins to give you access." She thanked him. They finished dinner in silence. It was not, she found, an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had arrived, without explicitly negotiating it, at a mutual understanding, that they would not perform more feeling than they had. The days settled into a shape. She rose early, before the household. She had always found the early morning the only genuinely honest time of day. Before the performances began, before one was required to be legible to others, before the faces people wore for each other were properly assembled. She walked the kitchen garden in the gray light while the gardener's boy arrived to bank the cold frames, and she learned the property gradually, the way she had learned everything in her life, by going back again and again, in different light and weather, until she understood its particular grammar. The Duke was typically in his study before 8. She could tell by the light under the door when she passed. They did not seek each other out. But they were present to each other in the way that people inevitably are when they share a house that is large but not infinite. The distant sound of a door, the glimpse of a dark coat crossing the kitchen courtyard, the faint smell of wood smoke and horse that he brought indoors from his morning rides and left briefly on the air of whatever corridor he had passed through. On the 4th day, she found a discrepancy in the estate books. She spent the afternoon with it, working backwards through 3 years of accounts with the methodical patience of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that most problems, if examined carefully enough, eventually yielded their logic. By the time the light had failed and she was squinting at the figures by candlelight, she had traced the discrepancy to its source. The tenant rolls had not been properly reconciled with the actual rent ledger since the previous steward's retirement 18 months ago. The error was not a theft. The numbers were honest, just misaligned, a calculation carried incorrectly forward through 3 reconciliation cycles. The resulting gap amounted to a considerable sum that the estate accounts believed existed but did not. She wrote it up carefully, with all the relevant figures annotated, and left the paper on the Duke's desk when she went in to inform Mrs. Pleat that she would not require dinner that evening. He was reading it when she came down the following morning. He did not say anything when she entered. She poured her tea. The fire in the breakfast room crackled and popped. A draft found its way under the window sash. It always did, in the east-facing rooms, at this hour, and the candle on his side of the table leaned very slightly toward her, recovered, leaned again. "You found this in an afternoon?" he said without looking up. "A long afternoon," she said. "The reconciliation pages are not well organized. Hawkins files by date rather than category, which means cross-referencing requires more steps than it should. He looked at her. Hawkins is a good man, he said. He has been with the estate for 12 years. I know, she said. I said as much in the summary. The error is arithmetical, not moral. He will need to restructure his filing method, but that is a matter of training, not character. I am aware of what you said. He set the paper down. I am noting that you were careful to make it plain. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite enough to name, but present. Most people would not have taken the trouble. She looked at him across the table. I was a vicar's daughter in a previous life, she said, and then stopped herself because it was not true and he would know it. And the impulse to deflect with a pleasantry was an old habit she had been trying to discard. That is, I mean to say that I learned young that precision matters when someone's reputation is at stake. You were not a vicar's daughter. No, I was correcting myself. She paused. I beg your pardon. He looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he picked up his coffee and returned to the paper, and she ate her toast, and the fire crackled, and the draft found the candle again, and outside the window the kitchen garden was beginning, very tentatively, to show the first gray-green evidence of spring. The child arrived on a Thursday in early April. Rosalind was in the library, working through the botanical catalogs with the absorbed pleasure of someone who has discovered a collection better than expected, when she heard the commotion in the entrance hall, the sound of a carriage arriving with more haste than ceremony, raised voices, a door, and then a sound she initially took for an animal in distress before she understood, with a cold, clarifying recognition, that it was a child crying. Not loudly. The opposite of loudly. The suppressed, contained sound of a child who has been crying for a very long time and no longer has the resources for anything more. She went to the door. In the entrance hall stood a small boy of approximately 6 years, still in his traveling coat, his hat gripped in both hands, his face pressed firmly against the wall beside the first staircase. He was not weeping any longer. He was simply standing with his forehead against the plaster, as if the plaster, being cold and solid and without expectations, offered something the room could not. Behind him stood a woman in black, very thin, with the frightened, apologetic eyes of a person performing a commission they had not chosen and wished, sincerely, to be done with. She was speaking rapidly to Mrs. Pleat in a low voice. Rosalind caught fragments as she came down the stairs. His Grace's ward. The Lyndhurst boy. The accident, last November. He hasn't spoken a word since. They said His Grace had agreed to take him, they said. Mrs. Pleat caught Rosalind's eye over the woman's head with the expression of a very competent person confronted with a situation that exceeded the available competence. Rosalind came across the hall and crouched down, not quite to the boy's level, stopping about a foot above it, so that he would have to make a choice about whether to look at her. She waited. The entrance hall smelled of boot polish and damp wool, and the particular cold of Northumbrian stone in April. And outside the hall window the lake was very flat and very dark under an overcast sky, and somewhere in the distance a rook was calling from the elms. The boy turned his head, very slowly, and looked at her. His eyes were gray. He had a bruise above his left eyebrow, fading now to yellow at the edges. He was thin in the way that children become thin when they have forgotten, temporarily, that eating is something they do. Hello, Rosalind said. I am Rosalind. I live here. She paused and then said, because it was true and because she had found, in her experience, that children respond to specificity. That is the library, through that door. There are atlases in it. Good ones, with illustrations. Some of them have ships. She stood up smoothly, without fuss. You do not have to come in. I am only telling you where I will be. She went back into the library. She sat down with the botanical catalog and turned a page. She waited. After 4 minutes and approximately 20 seconds, she had been counting, without intending to, she heard the library door open. Small feet crossed the room, stopped, continued to the shelves. A pause. The sound of a small hand running along bindings. The atlases are on the third shelf from the bottom, she said without looking up. The one with the red binding has ships. There is also one with considerable illustrations of tropical birds, if you prefer birds to ships. Silence. Then the sound of the red binding being carefully pulled from the shelf. She turned another page. His name, she learned from Mrs. Pleat that evening, was Philip Lyndhurst. His parents, the father had been the Duke's closest friend since boyhood, had been killed in a coaching accident on the road to Bath in November. Philip had been in the carriage. He had survived without physical injury. He had not spoken since. The Duke was his guardian by a provision in the father's will, a provision that, Mrs. Pleat said carefully, His Grace had not anticipated being called upon so soon. That evening at dinner, the Duke said nothing about Philip. Rosalind said nothing about Philip. She passed him the salt when she saw his hand move toward it a moment before he asked. He noted this with a brief sideways glance, the particular look of a man who has noticed something and is undecided whether to acknowledge it. The fire behind him needed another log. A footman attended to it, and the fire caught and brightened and made the whole table warmer by several degrees. He will need a routine, she said, when the dessert course had come and the footman had withdrawn. The Duke looked at her. Philip, she said, children who have been disordered by grief, particularly grief that arrives without warning, as sudden loss does, need routine above almost everything else. Reliable times for meals, reliable people, reliable expectations. The unpredictability of the days following a catastrophe is what extends the distress. The routine says, this world still holds. It holds at the same hours it held before. A pause. You know about this, he said, not a challenge. A question that was also an observation. I read about it, she said, and I observed it, once, in a cousin's household. They lost a child in infancy, and the remaining children. The disruption to them was considerable. It was the inconsistency, more than anything, that prolonged the difficulty. She paused. It is not precisely the same situation, but I believe the principle holds. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had noticed he brought to things he was genuinely uncertain about. Not the cool, controlling attention he deployed in other contexts, but something more unguarded. He looked at you, he said, in the entrance hall. Mrs. Pleat tells me he has not looked at anyone directly in 3 months. She did not know what to do with that information. Precisely. So she did with it what she usually did with information that moved her. She set it aside to examine later. He was interested in the atlases, she said. Yes, said the Duke. No doubt. She looked up and found him still looking at her, not with the cool, evaluative expression he had worn for most of the past 3 weeks, but with something that had more edges to it, less resolved, something she did not yet have a name for, but which she noted and stored with the same quiet care she gave everything she had not yet understood. She looked back at her plate. Spring arrived in Northumberland the way it always did, late, reluctant, and then suddenly and entirely. The moors turned from gray-brown to a tentative, then insistent green. The lake lost its winter opacity and began to hold the sky in it again, pale blue and enormous. Philip began coming to breakfast, at first standing in the doorway and then, gradually, across 3 mornings, sitting at the far end of the table from the Duke and eating with the methodical, joyless efficiency of someone who has remembered that eating is something one does, but has not yet remembered why it might be pleasant. Rosalind read to him in the evenings. Not to him directly. She read aloud in the library while he sat in the armchair across the room, ostensibly looking at his atlas. If the atlas came down over the course of an hour until it rested on his knees, and if his eyes moved from the pages to her face, she gave no sign of noticing. She read natural history, expeditions to strange places, the journals of botanists in tropical territories where the plants were improbable and the birds were extraordinary, and the whole world was organized entirely differently from Northumberland. She did not know precisely when the Duke began standing in the doorway. She noticed it first as a quality of the air rather than a sight, a slight change in the draft from the corridor, a different density to the silence at the edge of her hearing. She looked up once, briefly, and saw the shadow of him in the half-open door. and looked back down at her page and continued reading without altering her cadence. When Philip's eyes finally closed and his breathing slowed into the deep, unconscious rhythm of proper sleep, she set the book down and looked toward the door. The Duke was there, one shoulder against the frame, looking not at her, but at Philip. His expression was the unresolved one she had been turning over for weeks, trying to find a name for. She looked at it now, while he was not watching her, and thought, grief. Not new grief, old grief, the structural kind, the kind that has been lived with long enough that it has become load-bearing, and removing it would require removing something else along with it. She stood quietly and came to the door. He stepped back to let her pass. For a moment they were very close, 2 feet, perhaps less, and she could smell the cold he had brought in from the evening. The wood smoke still caught in his coat, the faintest trace of something she associated only with him, which she had no name for and did not attempt to find one. "He slept," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. They stood in the corridor. The lamp on the hall table was burning low, and the shadows were long and uneven. "Thank you," he said. The words came out with the particular weight of something that had been held for some time before being released, carefully, against its inclination. She nodded. She went upstairs. Her hands, she noticed, as she reached for the door of her room, were not entirely steady. The fever began on a Monday. Rosalind noticed it first. Philip at breakfast, quieter than usual, which was saying something. His eyes a little too bright, his movements slightly imprecise in the way a child's movements become imprecise when the body is beginning to spend its resources elsewhere. She went to him after breakfast while he was in the library and put her hand against his forehead. And he let her, and the heat she found there was unambiguous. She moved quickly but without visible urgency. She had found that visible urgency in the presence of an already frightened child was counterproductive. She told him he would have his lunch in the warmer bedroom in the south wing today as a special occasion, and would he like to bring the atlas? He brought the atlas. She had him settled in the south bedroom, with extra blankets and the fire built high and the willow bark preparation from cook on the way, before she went to find Mrs. Pleat. The physician was sent for from Alnwick. She did not see the Duke until dinner when she told him. She told him plainly and in full, and gave him the information that mattered. The fever was present but manageable. Philip had been responsive and coherent through the afternoon. He had pointed at a picture of a Pacific Island bird and looked at her inquiringly, which she took as a good sign. The physician should arrive by morning. She had checked his temperature twice since lunch, and it had not climbed further. The Duke was very still while she spoke. "You have been managing this all afternoon," he said, when she had finished. "Someone needed to." He pushed back from the table. "I would like to see him." "Of course." They went upstairs together, and the house was quiet around them, the servants having gone below, the corridors dim and smelling of the cold stone and the last of the day's fires. The south bedroom had been Philip's for a month now, and it had acquired, in that time, the particular character of a room belonging to a child. The atlas on the bedside table, a feather he had found on one of the walks he had begun taking with her in the afternoons, a drawing he had made of the lake, which was not accurate but was recognizable. Philip was small in the large bed. The extra blankets were piled at the foot, and the fire had been built up well, and the room was warmer than the rest of the house by several degrees. He was asleep, but not peacefully. His face flushed, his breath audible in the quiet room, his body moving at intervals with the restless, involuntary motion of a child whose system is engaged in something that takes all its attention. Rosalind sat in the chair she had placed by the bed that afternoon. The Duke stood at the foot of the bed, and she watched him look at Philip for a long time, and she watched his right hand clench slowly at his side. "He will be all right," she said. "You cannot know that." "No, I cannot know it with certainty." She kept her voice steady, not falsely calm, but level. The way she had found that level voices were more useful than soothing ones when someone was genuinely frightened. "But his fever has not climbed in 3 hours. He is responsive. He is otherwise well nourished and strong. Those are good signs, and I have seen worse presentations resolve without incident." A pause. I have also seen worse that did not resolve. I am not telling you there is no risk. I am telling you the evidence currently favors him." He looked at her. In the firelight, his face was unguarded in a way she had rarely seen it. The set of his jaw was familiar, the control, the discipline, but behind it something else was visible that the familiar expression usually kept hidden. A kind of terrified helplessness that she recognized, with a sudden, unexpected intimacy, because she had felt it herself, over a different child, in a different room, years ago. "Sit down," she said. "You need not stand." He hesitated. Then he pulled the other chair to the bedside, the one that had been against the wall, and sat. They sat on either side of Philip while the fire burned and the house settled around them, the old timbers contracting in the night cold, the wind coming off the moors and finding all the imperfections in the old window frames. The lamp between them was low, throwing warm light across the bedclothes, across Philip's flushed face, across both their hands resting near each other on the arms of their chairs. At some point, she could not have said when exactly, the Duke said, "His father was my closest friend." She waited. "We were at school together. 25 years since we were boys of 8. He was the kind of person who could be in a room and make everything in it function better, simply by being present. I never knew anyone who disliked him." He was looking at his hand on the chair. "The accident was in November. They were traveling to visit her family in Bath. I should have been in the carriage with them. I had planned to come, and then at the last moment I had a meeting. Whitmore, about the entail." He paused. "A meeting about the entail." The fire shifted. Outside, the wind came in a long, sweeping gust and passed. "Guilt does not require a logic," Rosalind said quietly. "It only requires a wound." He looked at her with a quick, startled expression, as if she had said something that had arrived somewhere he had not been expecting it to land. "My mother," she said by way of explanation, and then stopped, because she did not generally explain herself, and discovered that, with him, she wished to. "My father he was not a good husband to her. I was old enough to understand it and not old enough to prevent it, and I spent considerable time afterwards cataloging the things I might have done differently." She paused. "I eventually concluded that the catalog was a way of remaining near the thing, rather than a way of repairing it." A long silence. "I understand that," he said quietly. Outside the window, the wind eased, and in the quiet following it, Philip's breathing steadied. Not dramatically, gradually over the next quarter hour, while they both listened to it without speaking, the particular quality of it shifting from labored to something closer to ease. At 2:30, when the physician arrived, the roads had been better than expected, and he had ridden through the night. He found the fire still burning and both chairs occupied. One of the occupants was asleep, Rosalind with the Duke's coat laid across her shoulders, her head tipped against the chair back, one hand open in her lap. Philip's fever had broken an hour before. The physician said so to the Duke, quietly, and the Duke looked at Rosalind for a moment before he answered. "I know," he said. 3 days after Philip's fever broke, Cecilia arrived. She came without announcement, without letter, simply appeared in the entrance hall on a wet Friday afternoon, her traveling coat dark with rain and road mud, her face thinner than Rosalind remembered, and her eyes doing the old familiar thing, cataloging and assessing from the moment they entered the room. Rosalind was at the top of the stairs. They looked at each other across the entrance hall for a moment. Below them, Mrs. Pleat stood at the foot of the stairs with the expression of a woman who had seen a great deal and was waiting to see what species of thing this would turn out to be. "You look well," Cecilia said. The words were not quite a compliment. "Come in out of the rain," Rosalind said. She went to the Duke's study. She did not know the best way to begin, so she began as she had learned to begin most things, plainly. "My sister has arrived." He was at the desk. He looked up. Something in his expression settled. Not surprise, she thought, but the look of a thing taking the shape it had been half expecting. "I see," he said. "She has not come in goodwill." Rosalind came into the room properly and stood near the fireplace, which was burning well. "I know my sister," She has come because something has gone very wrong and she has exhausted her other options. I thought you should know that before you spoke with her, so that you are not deceived by whatever presentation she offers." He stood and came around the desk, and he stood a few feet from her with the particular quality of attention he had been giving her more frequently in recent weeks, as if he was reading something in her face that he had not yet decided how to respond to. "What do you want me to do?" he said. The question stopped her. She had not expected to be asked. She stood with it for a moment. "I don't know," she said, honestly. "I know that whatever she says, whatever she asks, she is not my better self. She is the version of me that my father preferred, and she has always known it, and she made her choices as clearly as I made mine, even if the circumstances of those choices were different." She paused. "I do not wish to see her destroyed, but I am no longer willing to be her substitute. I have been that long enough." She had not intended to say that last part. It came out before she had properly assembled it. A pause. "You have never been her substitute," he said. She looked up. He was very direct. He had always been direct. It was one of the things she had found initially alarming about him and had come to find instead the quality in him she trusted most. "I was deceived at the altar," he said. "That is entirely true. But the woman who found the error in the accounts, who read to Philip when no one asked her to, who sat up through the night without complaint, who told me plainly to sit down when I was standing at the foot of that bed like a man who had forgotten he had legs." He stopped. "That is not a substitute. That is the only person I have been willing to be honest with in 5 years." The fire in the study was burning very well. Through the window, the lake was gray and dimpled with rain, and the moors behind it were indistinguishable from the sky. She did not know what to do with kindness. She had not known what to do with it since childhood, specifically with kindness that was accurate, that saw her and meant her, and was directed at no more charming or convenient version of herself. It produced in her a sensation like vertigo, pleasant and frightening in precisely equal measure. "Your Grace," she began. "Evander," he said. She looked at him. "Evander," she said. He reached out slowly, with the deliberateness that characterized everything he did when it mattered, as if he were deciding each movement individually before committing to it, and took her hand. Not the gloved one, the left hand, the one with the scar. He held it with his thumb resting across the old silver line, and she felt the faint, steady pressure of it, and neither of them spoke. Then Cecilia's voice came up from the hall below, sharp and carrying, inquiring with considerable impatience where the housekeeper was, and the moment broke cleanly, the way a held breath breaks. He released her hand. He straightened. She could see him assembling the familiar composure back into place, the controlled expression, the set of the jaw, but not entirely. Something of the previous moment remained at the surface, not quite contained. "I will speak with her," he said. "I would prefer to be present," said Rosalind. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I expected you would." Cecilia had been put in the blue sitting room. She was standing at the window when they came in, turned with the well-practiced grace of a woman who had spent her life moving in and out of rooms to greatest effect. She looked at Evander. She looked at Rosalind. Her expression arranged itself into injured dignity, the wronged party, the displaced original. "I see you are both quite comfortable," she said. "Cecilia," Rosalind said, "sit down." Cecilia sat. It surprised both of them, Rosalind suspected. "I find myself in some difficulty," Cecilia said, and then the injured dignity expression faltered, briefly, and something more genuine appeared in its place, exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, the particular naked fear of a person who has been alone with her circumstances for some time and has run out of ways to reframe them. Rosalind had not seen that expression on her sister's face often. When she had, the circumstances had always been severe. "Captain Hurst," Cecilia said. "He has gone abroad. He has been gone since January, and I am—" She stopped, began again. "I lost the child. In January." The sitting room was quiet. Rosalind had not known. She absorbed this in the same way she absorbed most things that struck her unexpectedly, not with any visible alteration, but with the particular inward stillness of someone filing information somewhere it will be examined later, when there is room. Rosalind looked at her sister. The thinness of her, the lines at the corners of her eyes, new since last year. The hands folded in her lap with the rigid, deliberate stillness of someone holding themselves together by will alone, because will was all that remained. "I thought," Cecilia continued, looking at Evander with an expression that was partly calculation and partly underneath genuine desperation, "I thought perhaps the marriage might be reviewed, given the circumstances." "No," Evander said. His voice was not unkind, it was simply final. Cecilia's composure held for a moment, then it did not. "Then I thought—" She stopped. Her chin dipped. She looked at Rosalind, and the performance dropped entirely, leaving something younger and more frightened behind it than Rosalind had seen in years. "I thought I had nowhere else to go. I don't know why I came here, except that you are. You are the only person I have not yet ruined." The silence in the sitting room was of the particular quality that follows a true statement made, unexpectedly, in a place accustomed to managing them. Rosalind crossed the room and sat beside her sister on the settee, not touching, close enough that the proximity was itself a statement, a declaration of continued relation that Cecilia had not asked for and that she had, arguably, forfeited. "You will stay here," Rosalind said. "For now, you will stay." Cecilia looked at her. The gratitude in her expression was real, and it was, Rosalind could see, mixed with something else. The specific discomfort of being the recipient of a generosity that one knows is unearned, which is a heavier thing to receive than deserved kindness. "I don't—" Cecilia began. "No," Rosalind said. "You don't. But you are my sister, and that is not a thing that changes on account of circumstance." She looked up. Evander was standing near the door, and when she found his eyes, she saw in them something she had not expected. Not from him, not from anyone, not directed at her. Pride. The particular quiet, certain pride of a man watching someone he has been paying attention to confirm what he had hoped to find. She looked away before he could see what that did to her face. The window latch in the blue sitting room had come loose and was rattling softly in the wind off the moors. One of the candles needed trimming. The clock showed 4:30, and through the window the rain was still falling. A week passed. Cecilia stayed. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have been reduced by circumstance past the point where performance is possible. Not performing quietness, but simply without the resources required for anything else. She took her meals with them. She read. She walked in the kitchen garden in the mornings, not far and not for long, but she walked. She did not look at Evander for more than a moment at a time, and he treated her with the scrupulous, impersonal courtesy he reserved for people whose presence he had accepted and whose character he had not yet decided what to do with. Philip was recovered. He came back to the breakfast table with his color returned, ate with something approaching appetite, and began, for the first time, to stay in rooms that other people were in without pressing himself against the nearest wall. He was still silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was less like the silence of a child who had forgotten how to speak, and more like the silence of a child who was deciding whether the moment warranted it. On the third morning after Cecilia's arrival, he appeared in the doorway of the blue sitting room while Rosalind was reading, and Cecilia was sitting near the window with a piece of embroidery she had not touched in 40 minutes. Philip stood in the doorway and looked at them both. Then he looked at the book in Rosalind's hands. In the voice of someone using a muscle they have not used in a long time, rusty, precise, effortful. "What are you reading?" The embroidery did not move. Cecilia had gone very still. Rosalind kept her face entirely composed. "Natural history," she said. "Come and see." He came. Cecilia made a sound quietly that was not quite a breath and not quite a word. It was the day after that when Rosalind found Evander in the walled garden. It was late afternoon, the light going flat and golden, the way it does in late spring in the north, washing the stone walls and the long beds, and the unpruned roses warm. He was standing at the far end of the garden near the old rose wall, not occupied with anything, simply standing, looking out over the top of the wall to where the moorland rose to meet the sky in a long, uninterrupted line. He had his coat off, which she had not seen before in the garden, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked more like himself, more plainly, more essentially himself, than he ever looked in company. She went and stood beside him. For a while neither of them spoke, and the silence was the old silence, the comfortable one they had assembled over weeks of breakfast tables and dinner tables and corridors, and it required nothing of either of them. "She will be all right," Rosalind said eventually. "Not about Cecilia." He understood. "Yes," he said. "Because of you." "Because of himself," she said. "Children return to themselves. We can only make the conditions less hostile." He turned to look at her. The light at this hour was very direct, and she felt it, the particular quality of being seen clearly and completely, without the softening of candlelight or the distance of formal arrangement or the management of circumstance. She had spent her entire life being overlooked and being looked at with this quality of attention, sustained, specific. Intent was still something that produced in her a complex sensation she had not fully mapped. "I owe you an honesty," he said. She waited. "I told myself in the beginning that the marriage was a practical solution to a situation not of my making, a rational arrangement between two people who had both been acted upon by others." He looked back over the wall at the horizon. "I told myself that for approximately 3 weeks. Then the accounts arrived. And then Philip arrived. And then—" He stopped. A pause. "Then I stopped being able to tell myself that with any conviction, and I found I was at a loss what to tell myself instead, because the thing I was actually feeling was considerably less convenient." She waited. "I want to be clear with you," he said, "because I have found, in your company, that clarity is possible in a way it has not been elsewhere, and I would rather be clear than manage it." He turned to face her properly, and she faced him, and the late light was between them, warm and level. "I did not marry you. I married your sister. But your sister did not care enough to stay, and I—" He paused. "I find I am not interested in annulments. I find I am not interested in arrangements. I find I am interested only in you, in the person who has been quietly and entirely herself in this house for 2 months, and has asked for nothing and given everything, and has not once pretended to feel something she did not feel, or managed me into something convenient." He held her gaze. "If that is something you could ever want, if I am something you could ever want, I am asking plainly, because I believe you prefer it." The walled garden was very still. The roses on the north wall were not yet in bloom. They would come in another month, in the great extravagant cascade she had been watching build toward, through the pruning and the winter and the slow, tenuous green of early spring. But the canes were fully leafed out, and the air near the wall had the particular sweetness of foliage warming in late sun. Somewhere in the kitchen garden, a thrush had been singing for some time, entirely unconcerned with either of them. Rosalind looked at him. She thought about the girl in the vestry, 2 months ago, standing in her sister's gown and her sister's gloves and being told to walk. She thought about what she had expected from this life, which had been very little, because she had learned very young that expectation was a kind of exposure, and that protecting herself from disappointment required not expecting anything she cared about. She thought about the cold cup of tea and the crossing sweeper, and the accounts, and the library, and the fire she had found him building at 7 in the morning, and Philip's steady breathing in the low lamplight, and the coat across her shoulders. She thought about the thumb, steady on the old silver scar. "Yes," she said. It was a small word. She meant it as precisely as she had ever meant anything. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, slowly, with the care he brought to everything that mattered, as if deciding each movement before committing to it. His hand came to rest against her jaw, warm and certain, and she did not step back. Then he kissed her, not with urgency. with the quality of something that has been waited for and will not now be hurried. Careful at first, and then not careful at all, and then careful again, but for different reasons. She had one hand pressed flat against his chest and felt, through the layers of his shirt and waistcoat, his heart doing something considerably less composed than his expression had ever suggested. The thrush continued to sing. When they drew apart, she had her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them, and when she opened them, he was watching her with an expression she had a name for now. She had found it over 2 months of watching and learning and understanding, and the name was simply love, in the specific form it takes in a person who has believed for a long time that he did not deserve to want things. "I am still Rosalind," she said. "Not Cecilia, not a replacement, only this." "I know," he said. "That is the point entirely." She laughed. Properly. The laugh that comes from somewhere undefended. The laugh she had not had occasion for in some considerable time. It surprised her by being there. He kept his hand against her face. Behind them, the gate to the walled garden stood open, and through it the moors stretched away to the horizon in all their gray, enormous indifference, and the evening light lay across them like something almost possible. 1 year later, Blackmir Hall, Northumberland. June. The roses came all at once. They always did on the north wall, held back and held back through the cold spring, and then released in a single extravagant week of pink and cream and ivory that transformed the walled garden from a place of potential into something that made people stop in the gateway and simply stand. Rosalind had been watching them build toward this for a year. Through the autumn she had inherited, through the long winter, through the tentative and unconvincing spring. She had her hands in the garden bed when Evander found her, weeding with the absorbed, unhurried concentration of a woman who prefers to do things properly. She did not hear him coming until he crouched down beside her. "Philip says there is a letter," he said without preamble, "from the Naturalist Society. He brought it at a run." "Already?" She sat back on her heels. She had sent the paper in March, a long paper, carefully argued, on the botanical specimens she had catalogued from the Hall's collection and their relationship to similar specimens gathered in the West Indies. She had expected a polite acknowledgement, perhaps in 6 months. "What does it say?" "I don't know. He wouldn't let me open it." A pause. "He said it was yours." She pulled off her gloves. Her hands were dirty, and the ring was on her left hand, and the scar was on the inside of the wrist, as it had always been, as it would always be. He had a habit of looking at the ring, she had noticed, not obviously, not with any performance of sentiment, but in the way a person sometimes looks at a thing that means something they haven't finished understanding. She looked at him looking at it. "You are looking at my ring again," she said. "I am not." "You are." She held her hand toward him and he caught it, as she had known he would. "Evander." "I am going to tell you something." He looked at her over their joined hands, and the expression on his face was the real one. The open one. The one that had taken some weeks of careful observation to locate and rather longer to stop being startled by. "Tell me," he said. "I am expecting a child." The walled garden held very still for a moment. The roses and the beds and the old stone walls and the long June light across all of it. Then he said quietly, "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been well for 3 months, and I intend to be well for considerably longer." She paused. "I told Philip this morning. He has decided the child will require an atlas." Evander looked at her for another moment. Then he brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against the scar on her wrist. The old silver line, the mark that had given them away, the mark that had started everything, and held them there, his eyes closed. She let him. From inside the house she could hear Philip's feet on the stairs, rapid and purposeful, coming toward the garden, already, she suspected, carrying the letter and the relevant atlas. Cecilia had gone to Bath in March, quietly, with a letter of introduction to a cousin and enough money to begin again. She had embraced Rosalind before she left, briefly, without words, as sisters who have been through something embrace, which is differently than other people do. Rosalind had let her go without reproach, because reproach was a weight she did not intend to carry, and because the future was a room she preferred to enter without the furniture of the past blocking the door. Evander raised his head. He looked at her in the late morning light of the walled garden of Blackmir Hall, with the roses in full bloom around them, and a thrush beginning, somewhere in the elms beyond the wall, and he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that was more accurate than this. Her hand in his, the ring where it belonged, the scar and all its history, and ahead of them, the whole long, ordinary, extraordinary life of two people who had found each other at the wrong end of a deception and had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to stay. Philip came through the gate at a run, the letter in one hand and the red atlas in the other. The roses were extravagant and completely unconcerned. If you stayed through every chapter, through every quiet morning and every long night, thank you. Leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you. I read every single one. Thank you for being here.